On a humid April morning in 1959, 3 gunshots echoed through a quiet apartment in Bombay, forever changing not just 3 lives, but the entire landscape of Indian criminal justice. Commander K.M. Nanavati, a decorated naval officer, had just killed his wife's lover in what he claimed was a moment of uncontrollable rage. But was it really? This single act of violence would trigger the last jury trial in Indian history, divide a nation along communal lines, and force the highest courts to grapple with questions that go to the very heart of justice. Can betrayal justify murder? Should public sympathy influence legal verdicts? And when does honor become a license to kill? This is the story of a case that became a cultural phenomenon, a legal landmark, and ultimately, the end of an era. It's the tale of how one man's personal tragedy became India's most debated murder case, inspiring films, dividing communities, and forcing a young democracy to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, media, and the power of public opinion. The year 1959 found Bombay at the height of its post-independence optimism. The city hummed with the energy of a nation building itself, its streets filled with the sounds of construction, commerce, and cinema. The humid air carried the mingled scents of sea salt from the harbor and the spices of street-side vendors. In the affluent neighborhoods where the city's elite lived, Art Deco apartments rose like monuments to modernity, housing the naval officers, business magnates, and film stars who were crafting India's new identity. It was in this world of promise and prosperity that Commander K.M. Nanavati had built his life. A Parsi officer in the Indian Navy, Nanavati embodied everything the new India aspired to be: disciplined, educated, cosmopolitan, and successful. At 34, he was tall, handsome, and respected, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and the quiet confidence that came from serving his country with distinction. His record was exemplary, his future bright, his reputation beyond reproach. Nanavati's wife Sylvia was everything a naval officer's wife was expected to be: beautiful, charming, and capable of managing both household and social obligations with equal grace. Born in Portsmouth, England, she had married into Indian naval aristocracy and adapted to her new life with apparent ease. She was petite and elegant, with the kind of refined beauty that photographed well at naval functions and embassy parties. Together, they had 3 children, and seemed to represent the perfect synthesis of East and West that characterized the cosmopolitan elite of independent India. But beneath this picture of marital success lay the strains that military life inevitably placed on families. Nanavati's duties frequently took him away from home for months at a time, leaving Sylvia to manage not just the household, but the loneliness that comes with being married to the sea. The naval quarters that should have been filled with laughter and conversation instead echoed with silence, broken only by the sounds of children playing and a wife waiting for her husband's return. Into this emotional void stepped Prem Bhagwanda's Ahuja, a wealthy businessman who moved easily through Bombay's social circles. Ahuja was everything that Nanavati, in his frequent absences, could not be: present, attentive, and available. A successful trader with interests in various businesses, he had the means to court a lonely woman with expensive dinners, luxurious gifts, and most importantly, constant companionship. If Nanavati represented duty and honor, Ahuja embodied pleasure and immediate gratification. The affair that developed between Sylvia and Ahuja was, by all accounts, passionate and consuming. For approximately 18 months, while her husband served his country on distant seas, Sylvia found in her lover the emotional and physical intimacy that her marriage had failed to provide. It was a relationship conducted in the shadows of Bombay's elite social scene, hidden from the gossips and moralists who would have destroyed both their reputations had the truth emerged. But secrets, particularly secrets of the heart, have a way of revealing themselves in the small betrayals of daily life. When Nanavati returned from his latest deployment, he found his wife changed in ways that a man trained in observation could not ignore. There was a distance in her manner, a distraction in her conversation, a guilt that hung around her like an expensive perfume. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to a husband who knew his wife's every expression and gesture. The confrontation, when it finally came, was conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterized everything about Nanavati's life. There were no dramatic accusations or theatrical demands for explanation. Instead, there was simply a question, asked with the calm precision of a naval officer seeking information. What was wrong? And Sylvia, perhaps exhausted by months of deception or simply overwhelmed by her husband's direct approach, told him everything. The confession took place on April 27, 1959, a date that would become as significant in Indian legal history as any constitutional amendment or landmark judgment. Sylvia told her husband about Ahuja, about their affair, about her feelings of betrayal and confusion when she realized that her lover had no intention of marrying her or accepting responsibility for their relationship. She laid bare not just her infidelity, but her vulnerability, her loneliness, and her realization that she had been used by a man who saw her as nothing more than a pleasant diversion. Nanavati's response to this revelation was, by all accounts, remarkably controlled. This was not a man given to fits of rage or emotional outbursts. Instead, he asked the practical questions that a naval commander might ask when assessing a situation. Did Ahuja intend to marry her? Would he take care of her and the children? When Sylvia admitted that Ahuja had shown no such inclinations, Nanavati simply nodded and suggested they spend the day together as a family. What followed was one of the most chilling examples of premeditation, masquerading as spontaneous action in the annals of Indian criminal law. Nanavati took his wife and children to the Metro cinema, purchasing tickets for an afternoon show, and settling his family into their seats with the same care he might show when ensuring his crew was properly positioned before a difficult maneuver. He told Sylvia he had some business to attend to and would return before the film ended. She assumed he was dealing with naval matters. She had no idea she was providing her husband with an alibi. From the cinema, Nanavati drove directly to his naval base, where his reputation and position allowed him to sign out a loaded revolver with 6 cartridges. His explanation was routine. He needed the weapon for official duties. No one questioned a decorated commander's requisition request. The armory clerk noted the transaction in his logbook and watched as one of the Navy's most respected officers walked away with the means to commit murder. The drive from the naval base to Ahuja's apartment gave Nanavati ample time to reconsider his course of action. Traffic in Bombay moved slowly in those days, and the journey would have taken nearly an hour through the city's crowded streets. During that time, he could have turned around at any moment, could have chosen to handle his marital crisis through lawyers, confrontation, or simply the quiet dignity of a wronged husband. Instead, he used the time to prepare himself mentally for what he was about to do. Ahuja's apartment was located in one of Bombay's more fashionable districts, the kind of building where successful bachelors entertained their friends and pursued their romantic interests away from prying eyes. The flat was tastefully furnished, filled with the objects that money could buy but love could not provide. It was here that Sylvia had spent her stolen afternoons, and it was here that her husband would end the affair in the most final way possible. The confrontation between the two men was brief, and according to Nanavati's later testimony, conducted with a civility that seemed almost absurd given what followed. Nanavati, still wearing his naval uniform, asked Ahuja the same questions he had asked his wife. Did he intend to marry Sylvia? Would he take care of her and the children? Ahuja's response, according to Nanavati, was dismissive and crude. Do I have to marry every woman I sleep with? Whether these were Ahuja's exact words or Nanavati's interpretation of his response became a matter of intense legal debate. What was not disputed was what happened next. In a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but changed 3 lives forever, Nanavati drew his revolver and fired 3 shots into Ahuja's chest. The bullets, fired at close range by a man trained in marksmanship, were expertly placed and instantly fatal. Ahuja collapsed without a word, his blood spreading across the expensive carpet he would never again walk upon. The aftermath of the shooting was as controlled and methodical as everything else about Nanavati's character. He did not flee the scene or attempt to dispose of evidence. Instead, he calmly telephoned the police, reported that he had shot a man, and waited for them to arrive. When the officers entered the apartment, they found him sitting quietly beside his victim's body, the smoking revolver placed carefully on a nearby table. His surrender was complete and immediate, his explanations simple and direct. The man had dishonored his wife and refused to make amends. The news of the shooting spread through Bombay's social circles with the speed of scandal. Here was a story that had everything: a decorated war hero, a beautiful adulteress, a wealthy playboy, and a crime of passion that seemed to leap from the pages of a romance novel. But it was the response of the media, particularly the weekly tabloid Blitz, that transformed a simple murder case into a national obsession. Blitz was owned by R.K. Karangia, himself a Parsi, who saw in Nanavati's story not just news, but a cause. The magazine's coverage was unabashedly partisan, portraying the naval commander as a wronged husband and honorable officer who had been betrayed by those closest to him. Their headlines screamed of honor, duty, and the sanctity of marriage, while their editorials questioned whether any man could be expected to tolerate such humiliation without taking action. The narrative that Blitz created was powerful and persuasive. Nanavati was not a murderer but a victim, driven to desperate action by the betrayal of his wife and the callous indifference of her lover. Ahuja was portrayed not as a victim, but as a predator who had deliberately destroyed a good family for his own selfish pleasure. Sylvia was depicted as a weak woman who had been seduced and abandoned, more to be pitied than blamed. It was a story that resonated with traditional Indian values, while appealing to modern sensibilities about personal honor and family loyalty. The case attracted not just media attention, but community support on a scale rarely seen in Indian legal history. The Parsi community, small but influential, rallied around Nanavati as one of their own who had been wronged by circumstances beyond his control. Naval officers organized support committees and raised funds for his legal defense. Prominent citizens wrote letters to newspapers defending his actions and questioning whether the legal system was equipped to handle cases where honor and emotion trumped cold calculation. When the case came to trial in the Sessions Court of Greater Bombay, the atmosphere was more like a political rally than a criminal proceeding. The courtroom was packed with Nanavati supporters, many wearing badges or carrying signs declaring their belief in his innocence. The jury, composed of 8 Indians and 1 Anglo-Indian, entered the courtroom knowing that their verdict would be scrutinized not just by the legal community, but by the entire nation. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They argued that Nanavati's actions showed clear premeditation. He had obtained a weapon, traveled to the victim's apartment, and killed him in cold blood. The forensic evidence supported their version of events. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Ahuja had threatened or attacked his killer. The shots had been fired with the precision of someone trained in weapons use, and the killer had shown no immediate remorse or shock at what he had done. The defense, led by some of India's most prominent criminal lawyers, pursued a strategy of emotional appeal rather than legal technicality. They argued that Nanavati had acted under sudden and grave provocation, that any reasonable man in his position would have been driven to similar action. They emphasized his sterling military record, his devotion to duty, and the betrayal he had suffered at the hands of those he had trusted most. Their goal was not to dispute the facts of the case, but to make the jury understand why those facts should lead to acquittal rather than conviction. The testimony that followed was as dramatic as any courtroom scene ever filmed. Sylvia took the stand to describe her affair, her feelings of abandonment, and her ultimate realization that she had been manipulated by a man who had no genuine feelings for her. Her appearance, dressed in the simple clothes of a remorseful wife, was calculated to evoke sympathy rather than condemnation. She stood by her husband throughout the trial, a public demonstration of loyalty that many saw as evidence of her genuine remorse. Naval colleagues testified to Nanavati's character, describing him as an officer of impeccable integrity who had never shown signs of violence or instability. They painted a picture of a man under enormous stress, torn between his duty to country and his obligations to family, who had finally reached a breaking point when confronted with ultimate betrayal. Their testimony was designed to show that the shooting was an aberration, a single moment of madness in an otherwise exemplary life. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. Not guilty, by a vote of 8-1. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Nanavati's supporters celebrated what they saw as a victory for justice and common sense. Here was proof that the legal system could distinguish between cold-blooded murder and understandable human reaction, between criminal behavior and moral justification. But the presiding judge, Mr. Radulal Bachan Mehta, was not convinced. In his years on the bench, he had seen many cases where emotion had overwhelmed evidence, where sympathy had trumped law. The jury's verdict, in his opinion, was perverse and contrary to the clear evidence presented in court. Under Section 307 of the Criminal Procedure Code, he had the authority to refer the case to the Bombay High Court for review, and he exercised that authority without hesitation. The High Court's examination of the case was thorough and dispassionate. Unlike the jury, which had been swayed by emotion and public opinion, the appellate judges focused solely on the legal evidence and its implications. They found that Nanavati's actions showed clear premeditation. The acquisition of the weapon, the journey to Ahuja's apartment, and the methodical nature of the killing all indicated planning rather than spontaneous reaction. The forensic evidence, which the jury had largely ignored, was particularly damning. The absence of any signs of struggle suggested that Ahuja had been unarmed and unprepared for attack. The precision of the shots indicated deliberate aim rather than frantic firing. Most importantly, the time that had elapsed between Nanavati's discovery of the affair and his arrival at Ahuja's apartment provided ample opportunity for reflection and reconsideration, negating any claim of sudden provocation. On March 11, 1960, the Bombay High Court overturned the jury's verdict and convicted Nanavati of murder under Section 302 of the Indian Penal Code. The sentence was life imprisonment, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community of supporters who had believed that public sympathy and moral justification would ultimately prevail over technical legal considerations. The conviction was seen by many as a betrayal of natural justice, a triumph of legal technicality over human understanding. Protests were organized, petitions were circulated, and political pressure was brought to bear on anyone who might have the authority to intervene. The case had become less about the specific facts of one man's crime and more about broader questions of justice, mercy, and the relationship between law and morality. Nanavati's appeal to the Supreme Court of India was heard by the highest legal minds in the country, judges who understood that their decision would establish precedents affecting criminal law for generations to come. The court's analysis was exhaustive and scholarly, examining not just the facts of the case, but the broader principles of criminal liability that it represented. The Supreme Court's judgment, delivered in November 1961, was a masterpiece of legal reasoning that established the framework for understanding grave and sudden provocation that continues to influence Indian criminal law today. The court held that for a killing to be justified as a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder, the provocation must be immediate and the response spontaneous. The cooling-off period that had elapsed between Nanavati's discovery of the affair and his killing of Ahuja was sufficient to negate any claim of sudden provocation. The court's decision was final and binding, but it did not end the case's impact on Indian society. Public support for Nanavati remained strong, fueled by continued media coverage and the persistent narrative that he was more victim than criminal. The Parsi community, in particular, continued to view his conviction as an injustice that demanded political remedy, since legal remedy had been exhausted. The political dimensions of the case became apparent when Nanavati was granted pardon by the governor of Maharashtra in 1964, after serving only 3 years of his life sentence. The decision was controversial and widely criticized by legal experts who argued that it undermined the authority of the courts and established a dangerous precedent for political interference in judicial decisions. But for Nanavati's supporters, it represented the ultimate victory of justice over technicality, mercy over rigid law. The aftermath of the Nanavati case extended far beyond the fate of one naval officer and his victim. The case had exposed fundamental flaws in the jury system that led to its complete abolition in Indian criminal law. The spectacle of a jury verdict that ignored clear evidence in favor of emotional appeal convinced lawmakers that such a system was incompatible with the requirements of justice in a modern democracy. The case also marked the beginning of trial by media in India, establishing patterns of press coverage and public involvement that continue to influence high-profile cases today. The success of Blitz in shaping public opinion, and ultimately, the jury's verdict demonstrated the power of media narrative to overwhelm legal evidence, a lesson that would be repeated in countless cases over the following decades. Perhaps most significantly, the Nanavati case forced Indian society to confront uncomfortable questions about honor, masculinity, and violence that remain relevant today. The widespread sympathy for a man who had killed to preserve his honor reflected deep cultural attitudes about gender, marriage, and personal dignity that existed alongside more modern concepts of legal equality and individual rights. The case inspired numerous films, books, and cultural discussions that explored its themes of betrayal, honor, and justice. Bollywood embraced the story as a perfect blend of romance, drama, and moral complexity, producing multiple adaptations that further embedded the case in popular consciousness. These cultural productions often emphasize the romantic and tragic elements of the story while downplaying the more disturbing implications of vigilante justice and honor killing. Nanavati himself moved to Canada with his family after his pardon, seeking the anonymity and fresh start that India could no longer provide. He lived quietly there until his death in 2003, largely avoiding public attention and rarely discussing the case that had made him famous. For him, the price of honor had been not just the life he had taken, but the life he had been forced to leave behind. Sylvia, who had stood by her husband throughout his ordeal, faced her own form of exile from the society that had once welcomed her. The affair that had started as a response to loneliness had ultimately cost her not just her lover and her husband's freedom, but her place in the social world she had known. Her story served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of female infidelity in a society still struggling with questions of gender and autonomy. The Sindhi community, to which Ahuja belonged, felt that their concerns and grief had been largely ignored in the media coverage that focused on Nanavati's honor and Sylvia's betrayal. They argued that Ahuja had been demonized unfairly, portrayed as a predator when he might have been seen as simply another person caught up in the complexities of human emotion and desire. Their perspective highlighted how communal identity influenced public perception of crime and victimhood. As we reflect on the Nanavati case more than 60 years after it captivated the nation, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that many of the issues it raised remain unresolved. The tension between legal justice and popular opinion continues to influence high-profile cases in India's courts. The power of media narrative to shape public perception of guilt and innocence has only grown stronger in the age of 24-hour news and social media. The questions about honor, masculinity, and violence that the case raised remain relevant in a society still grappling with gender equality and personal autonomy. The case also serves as a reminder of the dangerous seductiveness of simple narratives in complex situations. The story of the wronged husband taking justified revenge on his wife's seducer appealed to audiences because it provided clear heroes and villains, obvious right and wrong, satisfying resolution to emotional conflict. But real life, as the courts ultimately recognized, rarely provides such moral clarity. The law's insistence on evidence over emotion, on procedure over passion, may seem cold and technical, but it represents society's attempt to ensure that justice is blind to sympathy, prejudice, and popular opinion. The abolition of the jury system that followed the Nanavati case represented a fundamental shift in how Indian society balanced democratic participation with professional expertise in criminal justice. While jury trials embody important democratic principles about community involvement in legal decisions, the Nanavati case demonstrated that such involvement could be manipulated by media coverage and community pressure in ways that undermined rather than served justice. The case remains a landmark in Indian legal education, studied not just for its specific holdings about provocation and premeditation, but for what it reveals about the relationship between law and society, media and justice, emotion and evidence. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal sympathy to override legal principle, while also highlighting the very human needs for understanding, mercy, and moral complexity that pure legal reasoning cannot always satisfy. Today, as India's courts continue to grapple with high-profile cases that generate intense media coverage and public debate, the lessons of the Nanavati case remain strikingly relevant. The challenge of maintaining judicial independence in the face of popular pressure, the difficulty of separating legal guilt from moral complexity, the power of narrative to shape perception of truth, these issues continue to test the maturity and wisdom of India's democratic institutions. The story of Commander Nanavati, Sylvia, and Prem Ahuja reminds us that behind every legal case are human beings struggling with love, betrayal, honor, and desire in ways that legal categories cannot fully capture. Their tragedy became a national obsession because it touched on universal themes that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. But their story also demonstrates the importance of maintaining legal institutions that can resist the pressure of popular emotion and insist on the difficult, unglamorous work of determining guilt and innocence based on evidence rather than sympathy. In the end, the Nanavati case stands as both a fascinating piece of legal history and a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice in democratic societies. It reminds us that the rule of law requires constant vigilance, that popular opinion is not always synonymous with justice, and that the price of emotional satisfaction may be the undermining of the very institutions we depend on to protect all citizens equally under the law. The 3 gunshots that echoed through that Bombay apartment in 1959 continue to reverberate through Indian legal consciousness, reminding each new generation of lawyers, judges, and citizens that justice is not just about satisfying popular emotions or traditional notions of honor, but about maintaining systems that protect everyone's rights, even when doing so challenges our deepest beliefs about right and wrong, honor and shame, love and betrayal.